Hi, everybody. Welcome to Skeleton Keys.
I'm Torri and
And I'm John Booker.
And together we're going to try to unlock the mysteries of mythology and history in pop culture.
Torri, today we are looking at SpiderMan as modern myth. And I have been looking forward to this episode. I've been super excited. I never really thought about SpiderMan as modern myth, honestly, before the movie Into the Spider-Verse came out. I'd always liked Spider-Man in the comics. I liked Spider-Man films. I even had Spider-Man pajamas when I was a little kid. There's something about the idea of swinging through the air from building to building. And we can talk later about the fascination with spiders and what spiders kind of represent in culture. But I really became interested in this topic when I saw Into the Spider-Verse and saw this new character of Miles Morales. And it got me to thinking, if superheroes are these mythical archetypes in culture, and if they're projections of modern myth, how does Spider-Man fit into that? Because I see so many kids, especially around Halloween and different seasons, kids dressing up like Spider-Man. There's something about that character that seems to transcend culture and class and race. And there's something just everybody can connect to with Spider-Man, which is always a hint that this is a modern myth.
100%. And I think that comes even in the history of Spider-Man as well, because when Stan Lee was creating the character, there were so many teenagers who were buying comic books.
Yeah.
And his publisher was kind of against the idea of creating this teenage superhero.
Yeah.
But I think he understood that teenagers were making mistakes and that people will connect to a superhero who's not cool and not super strong, but is making his way. So I think that's a big reason why so many people have attached themselves to Spider-Man and why he's one of the most prolific superheroes we've had. I mean, how many super Spider-Man reboots have we had? People love this character and it's going to continue. I think we're at 7 movies now? I think that's an indication to the world that this character has longevity, and even a longevity all the way back to West Africa.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to something you said, because I think it's really important that this was one of the first superheroes that many people encountered who is a high school student.
Mm-hmm.
Because so many of the other superheroes are grown women, grown men who are out battling evil. And we want to be these characters. We have Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman. These are grown people. And with Spider-Man, you have this teenager, you have this high schooler who is really vulnerable and who goes through a lot of the same problems that the core audience for comic books, at least at the time, could relate to. These were not just projections or fantasies about the problems that audience faced. The Spider-Man and Peter Parker at the time was literally facing the types of issues and problems that the average reader was. So while it might not have been the first, for many comic book readers, it was the first encounter they had with a superhero that was around their age, that was around the same station in life that they were. And I think that probably had something to do with the way that people just grabbed onto this character, really related to him and ran with him.
Exactly. I think it's just the accessibility of it.
Yeah.
And what I find really interesting is that Stan Lee didn't name the character Spider Boy or Spider Teen because he wanted the character to grow.
Yeah.
He wanted the character to progress, which, like you were saying, he's not a fully formed man yet.
Yeah.
Like he's given this space to grow and make mistakes and become better.
Yeah.
And I think we as readers or to people who take in content want that space to be like, okay, I'm still figuring things out, but my heart's in the right place. And I think that's why people connect to Spider-Man and have continued to.
Yeah. That's what makes a mythical hero in many ways, is a character that has room to grow. If a character is not capable of change, that character probably can't be a mythical hero or heroine.
Exactly. If you're just fully formed and you're not evolving, how am I going to connect to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen this, I think, in other stories where a character is already completely there. And in some ways, I think the other superheroes that are fully evolved characters, they often, I think, struggle with telling the same stories over and over with those characters because we want to see how those heroes developed into who they are now. So we keep telling the origin stories of these heroes. But I don't know that audiences are just clamoring for the same story to be told over and over and over with the exact same details. We're okay with the archetypal or psychological story being told over and over and over, but we want to see these characters grow and change because it signifies to us that we can grow and we can change. And that's something that's deep in our psyches that we're going after.
Exactly. I mean, listen, I've said before, I'm a Wonder Woman fangirl, but I'm not Wonder Woman.
Yeah.
I wasn't crafted by the gods that I know of. Maybe I was. My mom was lying. But I was a high schooler who was into the really hot guy and he wasn't into me. I can relate to that.
Well, tell us a little bit about the history behind, is there some connection to spiders in historical figures that brings us a character like Spider-Man?
Well, I mean, if we're going to talk about historical figures, we've got to talk about Anansi.
Yes.
Because that is literally the Spider-Man.
Yes.
Anansi, Spider-Man, spider body. There's different ways of showing Anansi. So Kwaku Anansi is the trickster character from the Ashanti people and the Akan people, which is the area of Ghana and the Ivory Coast today. Obviously, borders were not the same way back when.
Yeah.
And Anansi is this character sometimes portrayed as a god, sometimes as a human, but always associated with the spider. He might be a man with spider attributes, such as 8 legs, or he could be a spider wearing clothes like a human, or with a face. But there's always a connection to the spider of weaving these webs. And especially in terms of weaving webs, he's known as the king of stories.
Yes.
Because what is a web but something that you get caught up in? And that's a story, especially in West Africa. And so the Anansi archetype has lasted so long, especially with the slave trade, which was in West Africa.
Yeah.
So the story of this trickster came over to the Americas, specifically the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And what's really great, and I always think is really interesting, and I think correlates with Spider-Man, is that Anansi is not the all-powerful and knowing God. He's really smart.
Yeah.
He gets by on his cunning. And especially when you think about coming over from the slave trade, people who were enslaved are looking at the Anansi, which came from their culture, and saying, he fought oppressors by using his wits and his cunning. And that's something that you can connect to more so than just the tough guy.
Yeah.
And so that it traveled all the way from West Africa.
Yeah.
It's still in history.
Well, that is really fascinating. I think sometimes being someone who grew up in Western culture with this monotheistic idea of God, it's easy to forget that most cultures around the world believed in multiple gods. They were polytheistic, and even today are polytheistic. And in some sense, we are trying to, I think, look at these mythologies and these ideas through a Western lens without fully appreciating that Anansi was a god, but he wasn't the only god. He was a god that could be summoned in times of need when that god was the most appropriate god to summon. And I think there's something really interesting about looking at a spider and creating a sense of deification of that spider, because we in the West tend to think of spiders as scary or gross, or they're hindrances, annoyances to most of Western culture. So I think there's something that we can really take as Westerners, that we can learn about why did Western African people deify the spider. And I think part of it might have something to do with something you mentioned, and that is the weaving of the webs. When you look at a spider's web, I don't know about you, I feel like it looks like a work of art.
Absolutely.
I mean, do you have that reaction?
Absolutely. I think it's you recognizing that something so small could create something that takes up space in a way that is undeniable.
Yeah.
Like it's not, you can't really dismiss a spider web.
Yeah.
You're going to know a spider web physically. And then you're going to be taken aback by the art form that is a spider web.
Yeah.
And so I think, like you're saying, just that connection to that, the power that this small little creature can have, and that he makes these webs and that his prey comes to him.
Yeah.
He just uses his smart. He steps away and lets them come to him.
Yeah.
It's not about an aggression or anything like that.
I really like what you're saying about the spider creating this massive spider web out of the spider's body, because we tend to think of gods or God as being this creative force. We point to gods as being the force responsible for the creation of the universe. And we think of God as being a creative being. And so when you look at this beautiful web that a spider is able to create, that also has the ability to trap food, and it serves all these purposes, but it's also beautiful. You really start to see the connection between our ideas and projections of who God is and the spider. Like, I think West African people were really amazingly deep in the way that they thought about spiders, especially compared with the rest of culture in the world. We tend to dismiss these things, like I said, as annoyances. And when you really consider the spider in that way, I don't know, that's what I love about characters like Anansi, is I learn something more about how humanity functions and how people around the world see the world differently than I do. And I'm better for it. I'm benefit from it.
Well, and I think it almost changes the way you look at spiders now. I used to always think, oh, the way spiders move is very unnerving because they don't move in straight lines. They'll kind of scuttle to the side. They'll do that. And then I thought about it and I was like, that's probably a smarter way of moving.
Right.
Like in terms of if you're running away from a predator.
Right.
So it's just, myth can kind of change your perspective on things.
Yes.
And seeing how other cultures see the spider now changed my perspective on how I saw the spider, from one of debilitating fear to one of, I understand you. You still scare me, but I understand you.
Well, it is time for our skeleton from the closet segment, where both of us share a skeleton from our own closet. Here on the Skeleton Keys podcast, we're all about transparency and sharing a moment from our own journey with the audience. So, Torri, have you prepared a skeleton to serve to us today?
I'm going to be honest with you. I'm terrified of spiders. And in doing research for this episode, listen, my degree's in Africana Studies. I know what Anansi looks like. But even just looking at drawings of Anansi with a man's head on a spider, I was very uncomfortable. So they scare me. I'm trying to break it, but they are my deepest fear. And I will never kill them. I will call someone over to deal with it, but I will not go near them.
That is a skeleton that many people have in their closet as well. Fear of spiders is not a skeleton to be ashamed of. That's not completely foreign to me. Yeah, it's not something that I will not lie and say that I have not had a few scares in my lifetime when a spider. I would say actually my fear has come more from the web of the spider. Have you ever walked face first into a spider web? It's kind of funny when people see you do that because you look like you're attacking the air, like a ghost has, attacked your face, because people don't see what you're battling. But I've had more than one instance in my life where I walked right into a spider web and looked like I was battling unseen forces that I'm sure people thought maybe there was a mental health issue going on with me. Well, thank you for sharing that moment. I too have a skeleton from my closet to share that relates to spiders. And I once thought that I could make myself more interesting by adopting an unusual pet. And at first I thought maybe I'll get myself a pet snake because, well, that would be an unusual pet. And it just seemed like it was mythological and that it was a good idea. And then I realized how afraid I was of snakes, especially going into the pet store. My childhood fears of snakes really rebounded. And I decided I'm going to look at maybe a pet tarantula. That would also be something, very fascinating. And so they had some at this particular pet store. And I walked over and they said, oh, we'll pick it up and we'll put it on your hand. And Torri, the minute that spider's hairy little body made connection with my skin, I let out a yelp that had not been heard from my vocal cords since I was probably 4 years old. And the dear woman who had taken the spider out had to take the spider and put it back in. And I left the pet store empty-handed that day, deciding that a dog can make you an interesting person as well. You don't need an exotic animal to be an interesting person. So that's a skeleton from my closet. Also a specific fear of hairy-bodied spiders. That's really what does it for me, is those little hairy bodies.
Like, I understand it's an evolutionary tactic, but do you need that?
If the purpose in evolution was to keep that creature from being eaten to drive others away, I would say evolution 1, human beings 0.
Yep.
Because it does its job fully.
We took the L on that one.
Yes, we took the L. Very good. Well, let's talk a little bit about the mythology of Anansi. And this is something I wish that we had 1,000 hours to delve into, because there are so many mythological stories that deal with Anansi. And I think one of the first things that we have to acknowledge is that Anansi comes from an oral tradition in Africa. In other words, the stories about Anansi were stories that people told even before there were written language to write them down.
Exactly.
And I think sometimes we forget that most myths actually started with pre-written culture when people pass these down from generation to generation. And of course, just like when you were little, did you ever play the game of telephone where you whispered something in people's ears and they whisper it around the circle and it comes out completely different on the other end?
Yes, yes, yes.
I think the same could be said of these mythologies. Anansi certainly had thousands and thousands of different stories associated with him. However, there are certain through lines and there are certain stories that, despite how many times the story was told over and over again, kept coming back, which lets us know that there's something archetypal at work in this character. And one of the things that continued to be a trait of Anansi's personality is something that you mentioned, and that is this trickster archetype. Now, a lot of people probably don't even know what the trickster archetype is. So just for the layperson, we can say that a trickster archetype is a personality that comes in and blows things up. They either make a big joke of everything, or they cause trouble, or they come in to really disrupt the status quo, is probably the most concise thing we could say about the trickster. This is an archetype that appears across cultures. In Native American cultures, the coyote and the raven were trickster archetypes. Sometimes a wolf played that trickster archetype. But in African mythologies, we had a number of different trickster archetypes, but none probably as well known as Anansi. And we did have Legba and some other African figures and deities who were also tricksters, but there was something about Anansi that seemed to give people hope. And I think we could connect that to Anansi being connected, in my opinion, with stories. Well, it's not my opinion that Anansi was connected with stories, but the reason that I think Anansi gave people so much hope was that Anansi was credited as being the person being the deity that brought stories to humankind. So the story goes like this, that basically we had this deity who was a sky god named Naomi, and Naomi had this box of stories, and all the stories were kept. And our friend Anansi decided that the world was very boring without stories, and decided to go and make a deal to try and bring stories down to the earth and give them to humans. And the sky god Naomi, he makes a deal with Anansi that basically he says, look, I'm going to ask you to capture 3 of the most difficult beasts on the earth. And you as a spider have to figure out some clever way to capture these 3 beasts. And if you capture these 3 beasts, then I will give you my box of stories. And to make a long story short, Anansi does just that. He very cleverly figures out a way to outwit each one of these beasts. And he gets the box of stories from Naomi, the sky god, and he turns the box upside down on the earth, and all the stories fall out and flow out to the planet, and he gives human beings stories. And so I think we can first see a bit of a connection to the way that this myth probably developed, where hunters in Africa are having to hunt down these very wily, wild beasts. And the idea that you have to show some cunning and cleverness to capture these beasts most likely is what connected to this story and made Anansi a deity in their eyes. So I have always liked, of all the stories surrounding Anansi, I've liked the story of how Anansi brought stories to humankind. Being someone who's devoted so much of my life to storytelling, this is one of my favorite archetypes, one of my favorite beings. I would also say that Anansi's archetype has appeared in different cultures in different ways. We see a similar archetype actually in Greek mythology with Hermes, who was a trickster god who also had the gift of flight. So there's similarities there. But we also hear of another story that comes out of Central Africa, and it's the story of Brer Rabbit. And the Brer Rabbit mythology is very much connected to Anansi's mythology. The stories that are told about Brer Rabbit are usually stories that originated with Anansi. And this even makes its way to the African diaspora with voodoo mythology and Haitian voodoo mythology. Anansi takes the form of Gide. And Gide is this character that sort of exists between the living and the dead and escorts people to the land of the dead, but is a trickster in Haitian voodoo culture that is very much the projection of Anansi. So that's another thing I love about mythology, is these archetypal myths keep transforming and keep growing and changing and making themselves completely relevant to whatever culture they manifest in.
I think it's really interesting too, that I find a lot of times, especially like in Western culture, if you say trickster, there's a sense of judgment on that.
Yes.
And especially in these African cultures, yes, he's a trickster, but it's not as cut and dry as like good and evil. He's not judged either way.
Yeah.
It's more of that's how he functions. That's how he utilizes that.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting to look at as well.
It's another thing that I think we can really learn a lot from African culture is there's not this binary approach of everything is either good or bad. It's either black or white, this rational thinking that we certainly have benefited from in some respects in Western culture, but we sure have lost a lot when we've completely rejected the non-binary thinking that is ancient from, for example, the peoples of West Africa. I just think there's a lot that we've lost. Even in the world of stories, we've lost these characters like Anansi, insisting on, well, every character's got to either be good or bad. We're just now exploring these anti-heroes that are in the place between black and white.
But I also think that's another reason why he's so accessible.
Yeah.
Because nothing is black and white. We can say that we're going to choose a side, but that's not how life works.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Anansi has figured out how life works.
Yes.
Is living in that gray.
Yes. Well, Torri, it is time for our second segment based around a key that we have found helpful. Every episode, we talk about a book, a film, a TV show, a comic, a graphic novel, something, maybe it's a TED Talk, something that we found helpful in our journey. And what have you been sort of vibing with? What's been exciting to you lately?
And examining the history of West Africa, which my ancestors are from West Africa, specifically Nigeria and Cameroon, it took me back to Alex Haley's roots. That's probably throwback for some people, but I was required to watch it when I was younger and read the book. And especially in learning about Anansi and growing up, like I said, I was scared of spiders, but understanding the power that oral history had, especially in the African diaspora, it brought me back to roots. And I rewatched it as an adult and understanding that the stories that I was told as a child from my parents are just as valid as the stories that I'm reading in books or that have been written down for years.
Yeah.
And Roots kind of brought all of that together for me as a kid and still made it so visceral as an adult.
Yeah.
So Alex Haley's Roots.
Was such an important piece of culture, not only the book, but the TV series. I remember as a child, it played on Sunday nights and our family watched it. And I'll be honest with you, as a white family living in the mountains of Colorado at the time, our family had no Black friends. We didn't know any people of color in that town. And that was really the first time that I remember as a family, we engaged in Black culture. And I'll be honest, it had a huge impact on our family. We sat around, even as a child, talking for days about Kunta Kinte and Chicken George and these different characters that really had an impact on us. So yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up Roots. I had not thought about that in a long time. Yeah.
No, it came up to me. I watched it recently and I was like, that really hit.
Yeah.
And then just even doing research on this, I was like, yeah, that's just a connection with my culture.
Yeah.
That reaffirmed that. But what about you?
Yeah. Well, I've been reading a new book. It's new to me. It's not a new book that just came out. It actually has been out for a long time. But it's a book called Woman's Mysteries, Ancient and Modern. And it's written by an author named Esther Harding. And let me just read you the little blurb of what the book is, because it's so interesting. The blurb says, here is a classic study of the feminine principle in myths, dreams, and religious symbolism. In presenting the archetypal foundations of feminine psychology, the author shows how the ancient religious initiations of the moon goddess symbolize the development of the emotions. Understanding the psychological meaning of these initiations, she believes, can help to heal the troubled relations between men and women today. It's so good.
Yes. I'm like, hell yes. Hell yes.
It's just a really wonderful book. It's certainly on the academic side. Esther Harding was a Jungian analyst that really goes deep and explores a lot of the women's initiation mysteries, especially in Greek culture. And I am just really learning a lot and gaining a lot in how to apply many of these ancient mysteries to our modern ways of living. There's just so much to take from there. So that's what I am exploring right now.
Well, and we're exploring it on this podcast.
Yes.
We're talking about how these ancient myths are in modern culture today.
Yes.
So you're nailing it.
Certainly Anansi appears in other manifestations of pop culture. One of the biggest currently has been the Neil Gaiman's American Gods series. And wow, Anansi or Mr. Nancy, as he is known in the American Gods series, is incredible. In the first season, sort of the introduction to Anansi on the ship is one of the most powerful moments of mythological discussion on a television show in history. Did you see it by chance, Torri?
I was shook to my core watching that.
Yeah.
Thinking of the Middle Passage and having, if you have not seen this, it is Anansi addressing the enslaved people on a slave ship making their way to the Americas. Yeah. And he's telling them what they're going to expect as Black people in America. And the monologue that is done is so powerful, but is so Anansi in the way that he affects different accents. I don't know if you noticed that.
Yeah.
That he affects Caribbean accents. He affects West African accents. So in a way, he's talking to the whole African diaspora, being like, this is what's going to happen to you in history. And it is a piece of work. It is gorgeous. It's uncomfortable and funny and dark. And it's no words.
Yeah, it's so good. So powerful. For people that appreciate that sort of take on this character of Anansi, Neil Gaiman went on to write a novel called Anansi Boys that also gets back into sort of the history of Anansi and takes that mythology even further. There's so many different places we could talk about and identify Anansi in pop culture. We sort of just have to pick one or two for the episode, but I think Anansi is an archetype we could come back to time and time again on this podcast and look at, because there's just so many different interesting manifestations of this deity, this mythological character in pop culture. You could do an entire podcast just on Anansi and never run out of material, I feel like.
You could weave so many webs as Anansi would. Now, we could talk about Anansi in pop culture for hours, but we actually have a special guest coming on the show who is an expert on pop culture and myth, Miss Gabby Frederick.
We are delighted to have Gabrielle Pedro Frederick with us. Gabrielle is a lifelong fan and student of mythology, somebody who also enjoys pop culture. She's currently finishing her master's in mythological studies right now at Pacifica Graduate Institute. She lives with her husband and 2 dogs in Washington, D.C., and she currently works with the programming and scheduling team at National Geographic, a channel that I love very much. So we are really, really delighted to have Gabby with us. Gabby, welcome to Skeleton Keys.
Thank you so much for having me. It's fantastic to be here.
Well, Gabby, we are talking Spider-Man today, and we've talked already about the idea that Spider-Man could be a modern projection of the West African deity Anansi. And one of the things that I would love to ask you about, because of your work in mythological studies, is how you see Spider-Man from a psychological perspective. What do you see that makes Spider-Man a character, a figure that people connect to psychologically?
Yeah, wow, there is a lot to unpack there. So let's see where we end up.
Okay.
I think Spider-Man, if you were looking at the original iteration, just to start off, he represents an everyman. I mean, I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created him to kind of reflect the everyday American teenager who, instead of having to acquire this great power or kind of work towards this goal, it was just kind of thrust upon him. And I think in terms of, from a psychological aspect, that's something that we deal with on a daily basis. It's not necessarily, something as grand as being bitten by a radioactive spider, but I think the challenges of just being a human in the day-to-day can sometimes feel like such a Herculean task to get through. And I think the reason a lot of people resonate with Spider-Man is because of, was he necessarily deserving to get bit by this radioactive spider and get these fantastical powers? No, he was just this ordinary kid and had this thing happen to him. And he just kind of, I guess, individuated that in a sense, kind of coming to terms with this monumental thing that happened to him. And I think that's a huge chunk of why he resonates so popularly as a character. And especially with Miles Morales, you have someone who's Afro-Latinx, which is such a marginally underrepresented group for a lot of people. And so to see someone of that minority come into the spotlight and to be received so well, I think it means a lot to so many people, regardless of your ethnicity. If you are a member of a minority, then seeing someone who's not typically represented is almost empowering. Yeah. And I think that contributes so much to the success of the character.
100%. And I think what was really interesting, about what you were saying is the question, is Spider-Man deserving? And I think that's a question we as human beings ask ourselves every single day. Am I deserving of this? What should I do with this power? So I think that's a really interesting way of looking at him.
Yeah, no, definitely. I know particularly, if we're being totally candid, I mean, I suffer with a little bit of anxiety and some depression, and you don't necessarily you don't really think about it in terms of that being something to hamper you from kind of living your day-to-day life. And I know in regards to mental health, that's something that's very underspoken. And yet, but people are trying to turn this into a conversation piece for pop culture to make it more acceptable and understanding of people to be talking about and to be speaking about. And I know for me, how do I properly explain this? You don't realize how much of an effort it is to kind of live with that until you see someone else who does not necessarily have to handle those issues go through their day-to-day so easily, if that makes sense. So I think it's kind of in that this is something that's been thrust upon me. How do I make something out of this and kind of overcome that for maybe not the greater good, but for my own greater good?
Really well said. I had not really thought about the mental health aspects of the narrative that's presented in Spider-Man, but that's really well said. I would love to hear more and just listen actually from you and Torri both. Being a white guy, I feel like Spider-Man for a long time was Peter Parker, and this was one of 1,000 white guy superheroes that we had in the canon. And when Into the Spider-Verse came out and Miles Morales hit the scene, it was something that fanboys and fangirls were super excited about because Miles Morales had been a character in the comics for some time. And it was not only one of my favorite comic movies, but one of my favorite films. And maybe part of it is that I had never seen that sort of representation on the screen, especially not in an animated film before. But why do we think that character and that presentation of Spider-Man was the only one to win Academy Awards? And it was just universally loved by fans and critics alike. So do you think it was the representation or what was happening there?
Sure. I think that it's a combination of things. And I think definitely the character of Miles is a huge part of that. Like I said, this is the first time we've seen a character not only of one minority, but of two. He's Afro-Latinx. And to see him on the big screen, like I said, was just such a pivotal moment for a lot of people of minority. I know even me personally, I'm Asian American, but I thought it was phenomenal to see such a segmented minority as the main character in a movie. And I think another thing that made this successful was that it was almost a passing of the torch from the Peter Parker that we knew to this new character. And we kind of see that in Endgame a little bit. Falcon becomes Captain America in the comics, and it looks like they're trying to do that in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So you actually see that passing of the torch onto this new character. And I also think another reason that the movie was successful, kind of as an aside to that, was the fact that it was so self-aware of what it was. You see it in the name, Into the Multiverse. It was a combination of different iterations of that character. And I think particularly I get a little picky about the canon sometimes. I love comic book movies. I love comic books. I love superheroes. So I know, like me personally, the X-Men movie series was a little hard to watch for me. But
Same.
Right? Because you try to separate the two, but it's just really hard. But I think what Spider-Man did, Into the Multiverse did, was that it took these different canons, these different multiverses, and blended them together. So it was hard to kind of pinpoint your canon when they were all canon in this film.
Yeah. When the film came out and I saw people commenting on Twitter, that I think was one of the surprises in many ways, was to see how universally beloved this was, because it honored so many people's definition of canon in this one film.
Right. And even the little throwaway bit at the end with Spider-Man 3000 and the Spider-Man meme where he's pointing at each other, it just became so self-aware that Spider-Man is so many different things to so many different people. And I think it was just done so well in this particular film.
I think it's honestly what you were saying about seeing that representation. What I really liked about Into the Spider-Verse is that he is Afro-Latinx, but a lot of times, and I don't know how you guys feel about this, sometimes diversity can be like, oh, we put this demographic in, but we're not actually going to examine the culture.
Yes.
And his culture was shown in that. Like, he's speaking Spanish and English. It wasn't just like a tokenism. It was like, this is a part of who he is. And that movie, it had no business being as good and as well done as it is. It didn't have to be that good and have these layers, but it did that.
Yes. Exactly.
You are someone who has formal training in the area of mythology. When you think about Spider-Man and mythology, what connections do you make? Where do you see Spider-Man as really being a projection of modern mythology?
That is a fantastic question. Wow, way to blindside me with that one, John.
No worries, no worries.
Well, what's funny, because the first thing that comes to mind is Anansi, the African spider who is traditionally known as a trickster. I was kind of sitting on that for a while, but what I thought was interesting about this connection of Anansi, the spider, and Spider-Man was this concept of Anansi as a spider, a very small, very minuscule thing. And yet here he was outwitting, outsmarting these creatures, scarier and bigger and more powerful than him. And I think you can see that a lot in the Spider-Man story, even as Peter Parker, who kind of starts off as this very minute in personality. He's very timid. He's nerdy. He keeps to himself. He's bullied. And yet once he kind of becomes Spider-Man, he gains that confidence to outwit and outsmart and defeat these powers greater and more sinister than he is. I mean, I'm thinking about Green Goblin in Into the Spider-Verse when he has that massive fight with that version of Green Goblin, or Prowler, who's faster than he is, or all of this. He's small, but he has so many other talents that kind of help him overcome these things that seem bigger than he is.
That's really true. You, as somebody who is a comic fan and somebody who goes deep on these stories, what do you think is going to be the impact of these wider range of stories that we're seeing in stories like Spider-Man? Because we not only have Spider-Man, we've got Black Panther with mythologies around Afrofuturism. We've got the first Asian superhero that Marvel is creating a film around coming out next year. As the mythology in some sense gets larger in pop culture, how is that going to change pop culture? What can we expect?
You're really hitting me with the hard-hitting question. Goodness. I think there's so much to unpack here. And I kind of want to tell you, wait a few years until I finish my PhD and maybe I can answer this better for you.
When we read your book, it's going to be exactly this.
No, but that's funny because that is something that I am hoping to explore in my PhD, is how these shared universes have become such a huge impact in this pop culture zeitgeist. And I think, well, from a depth psychological perspective, who is it? Hillman? John, maybe you could help me out with this. There's something about how we project what we're missing, or we tend to notice things that we're missing in our lives. And I think that's something that's really interesting about the sudden popularity of these shared universes, especially with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, who just did it so brilliantly, is that there's that interconnectivity between these different heroes and these different hero groups. And I think that kind of almost speaks to a type of projection on our culture, not to get like too political with it, but especially with the US and our current political climate, there's that sense of isolationism that we've been kind of feeling over these past few years. And these movies have exploded, but it's that camaraderie and it's that unification of these different groups that I just feel is very empowering for people, especially with such a wide range of characters that people of different personalities, of different minorities, of different genders can relate to. I think that's part of what makes it so successful.
I think it's the Marvel Universe is so beloved. I'm curious as what your thoughts on the trickster archetype, which Anansi is, but probably one of the most beloved characters in the Marvel Universe is Loki, who is another version of that trickster archetype.
Yes.
What do you think, like, why do you think that is? Why is that archetype lasted so long?
I think part of it is, I mean, who doesn't love Tom Hiddleston, first of all? And what's really interesting, I was having this conversation a few weeks ago with someone, is that for me, particularly coming from an Asian American background, is that culturally, we grew up kind of putting other people first and kind of sacrificing pieces of ourself for the good of the group, for the good of other people, and to kind of put ourselves on the back burner. But recently, you've kind of seen this kind of explosion of self-love and self-care more recently. And I think in a sense, maybe to not the extreme of Loki, but you kind of see this, I'm going to do this for me. This is something I'm going to do for myself. And I think that almost no nonsense, doesn't give an F kind of laissez-faire attitude is something that's starting to really resonate with people, especially recently.
I love how you say, oh, I'm blindsided by this question. I don't know what I'm going to say. And then you just give us this incredible answer to every one of these questions.
I know. I'm like, can I be blindsided once? Come on.
I love that. You're like, oh, I don't know what I could say to that. And then you just hit us with this incredible answer. That's amazing. So good.
Oh, you flatter me because I honestly think that this is just word vomit right now.
Oh, no.
It's beautiful.
Seriously. We want to be sensitive to your time, but I have one last question I'd love for you to expound on if you can. As somebody who loves comics, these characters, your Twitter profile picture has you in this very archetypal moment, kissing SpiderMan. It's very cool. As somebody who loves these stories and loves this type of pop culture, what is it that attracts you to it? Why do you connect with? Why are you somebody who loves mythology but also loves pop culture? How do you connect those two? What is it that really makes you passionate about this topic?
Wow. Do you have 4 hours? We could break this down. I think there are so many different facets to that question. I think, first of all, the first thing that came to my mind was kind of this idea that somehow inherently in mythology, magic is real. And that's not something you get to kind of experience in the day-to-day life. I wouldn't necessarily call it escapism, but it's just something more whimsical and a little more fantastical to kind of experience when it comes to mythology. And even in that sense, mythology is not a fable. There's not necessarily a moral or a lesson that needs to be learned at the end of it. Inherently, it's just the human experience, but it's elevated in a way that somehow resonates with people all over the world, and something that somehow withstood the test of time, even though we're not necessarily seeing the gods in our modern day pop culture, but we still have archetypes that remind us so much of these ancient characters. And I think that's what fascinates me, is that somehow these ancient themes have somehow resonated from the beginnings of time all the way up until now. And in a sense, we're still seeing them today in pop culture, in superheroes, in archetypes. I was reading an article the other day about something, I can't remember right now, but it was humorous because it was basically talking about like how some random pop teen TV show like Riverdale or something could somehow be mythologized. I don't know, but that's the one thing. And then I don't even remember the rest of the question. But that's basically the gist. And I think that's essentially inherently, that's at the heart of it, right? It's these grand characters and these grand stories that have somehow withstood the test of time through centuries and still managed to manifest themselves in stories today. And I think there's something to be said there about that. And for me, I think the reason I love pop culture so much is because you can see it a little more clearly with some of these. Obviously, there's the connection with Joseph Campbell and Star Wars. We see that obviously with these parallels that we make to superheroes and the gods. So yeah, I think there's something to be said about that.
So good. So good. Gabby, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. Will you promise that you will come back on and talk to us about other aspects of pop culture? This was so good.
Oh, thank you so much. Anytime that you guys are willing to have me, I will gladly come back and proceed to, once again, word vomit all over you.
Oh, you said word vomit, but you are far more articulate than you're giving yourself credit for. It really was great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Of course, of course. Yeah, we'll definitely have to compare notes about how your program's going at Pacifica too. I'm sure you've had Christine Downing and Lance and Patrick
Yeah. The Holy Trinity.
The Holy Trinity. Yeah. Oh, it's so good. Well, I really do want to continue to follow your work, and I'd love to have you back on. Torri and I are figuring this podcast out, but we're excited and have got sort of a good launch going right now. And we're going to really try and make a go of this thing. And it seems to be really working out. So we're excited.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to following you guys. This seems fantastic. And I would love to be back if you'll have me.
Well, we would love to have you. Well, thank you again for taking time to talk to us. And we can't wait to have you back on.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, you guys. Have a great weekend. Good luck with the podcast. I can't wait to listen to the premiere episode.
All right.
Thank you so much, Gabby. You have a great weekend.
Thanks. You too, guys.
Whether the connection is intentional or subconscious, I don't think that's the point when it comes to the connection between SpiderMan and Anansi. I think some of these truths are much larger than whatever our best intentions are as humans trying to connect these things. I think literally we have manifestations of the human subconscious that give us the sort of connections between SpiderMan and Anansi, especially as SpiderMan is displayed by the character of Miles Morales. I think we can get easily caught up in trying to figure out whether or not the creators of these characters and of these films were trying to do this. And I think that misses the larger point. Sometimes I get frustrated with that question of, well, do you think they were intentionally trying to do this? I don't think it matters. Does that bother you at all, Torri?
No, because I think it's deeper than that. It's deeper than I'm going to make a decision to use this mythological archetype. I think those archetypes and those stories are within all of us. And we just recognize it when we see the myth, or we recognize it when we see ourselves in Spider-Man. But that archetype is in every single one of us that want to tell different kinds of stories, that need to feel, am I deserving of this? How can I use my cunning and my wits against a larger foe? Those stories are universal. Yeah. It doesn't have to be intentional for them to resonate.
Well, and I think that's why history is so important. And I love that you have such a background in history to offer us, is because when we see how these things have played out, not just once, but things that rise up in history again and again, and the way that this sort of psyche manifestation has went out throughout the African diaspora, it makes it more fascinating to me than just some sort of blip on the cultural screen when we see this thing happen throughout history amongst different groups of people. Because one thing I think that's really important, and again, you can speak to this so much better than I, is it's easy to even lump everyone in West Africa into one culture or group. But the fact that Anansi appeared in various tribal groups throughout Africa is very important, because these are very distinct groups of people with different cultures and different languages. And even if Anansi had never made it out of Africa, it would still be one of the most incredible manifestations of a psychological character to appear in human history, just in the way that Anansi made his way throughout Africa.
100%. 100%. I mean, I think like you were saying, West Africa is not a monolith. Each culture, each people have a completely different culture, and each people will have a different Anansi story.
Yeah.
Because myth is never the same, like we were talking earlier about the game of telephone.
Yeah.
And so recognizing that, and then recognizing how the West African cultures used Anansi moving over when they were during the slave trade, how Anansi was looked at as a figure of hope, of someone using their wits against the oppressor, how that changed the slave trade, changed Anansi's story. It's so interesting viewing myth through a historical lens. Like you were saying earlier, Brer Rabbit.
Yeah.
That's what I grew up on.
Yeah.
But that's what I recognized being a Black woman in my culture. But I sometimes think my great-grandfather was born a slave. It wasn't very far removed for us. And so I think my Spider-Man might have been his Brer Rabbit, might have been my other ancestors' Anansi.
Yeah. Wow.
And thinking of it from that point of view it can be overwhelming, but I'm so appreciative of it.
That gives me chills to think about. I also just got chills because across the room right now, I can see a little spider crawling down my wall.
Are you kidding me right now?
I am not. Anansi is making a guest appearance on the podcast. I don't know if there's a better way we could wrap things up, but to give Anansi his silent last word on the podcast. Torri, if people are trying to get a hold of us, they can contact us at skeletonskeys.podcast@gmail.com. But where else might people want to track us down?
Well, if you want to track us down on the webs, the World Wide Webs, you can find us on our socials at Skeleton Keys Pod on Twitter and Instagram. You see how I did that with the spider and the webs?
Brilliant. Brilliant.
And you can also follow us at our personal social handles. Mine is Torri Yates-Orr.
I am at John, JOHNKBUCHER on Twitter and at Telling a Better Story on Instagram. And that's it for Skeleton Keys. We'll see you next time.